Here's what makes this decade genuinely different from every other one we've covered in this series. Your 50s aren't dangerous because of overconfidence, like your 40s can be. They're not dangerous because of lifestyle creep, like your 30s often are. Your 50s carry a completely different, much quieter risk, one that comes specifically from being close enough to the finish line to see it, but not yet close enough to actually stop running. If you're in your 50s right now, or getting there, I want you to stay with me for the next 15 minutes. Because understanding this specific decade, what actually changes in it, the very particular mistakes that show up here and almost nowhere else, and what genuinely protects you, might matter more than anything else in this entire series so far. Let's start with what actually makes this decade unique, because it's not really about age itself. It's about a specific collision of timeline and circumstance that only happens here. By your 50s, retirement has stopped being an abstract, distant concept and started becoming something with an actual, calculable date attached to it. This shift matters enormously psychologically. In your 30s and 40s, retirement planning operates in the realm of estimates and general direction. In your 50s, it starts to feel like a project with a real deadline, and that shift changes decision-making in ways that aren't always obvious. At the same time, this decade often brings a very specific kind of financial crossroads that doesn't exist earlier in life. Children, if you have them, are typically becoming financially independent, which frees up cash flow right at the exact moment aging parents may need more support than they used to. Healthcare costs start climbing, both in reality and in anticipated need. And for a lot of people, this is also the decade where career earnings peak, then sometimes plateau or even decline, particularly in industries where age discrimination, however illegal, remains a quiet reality. Here's the part that makes this decade specifically dangerous rather than just complicated. All of these factors converge at exactly the moment when there's the least amount of time left to correct course if something goes wrong. A financial mistake made at 32 has 3 decades to be absorbed and recovered through continued earning and compounding. The identical mistake made at 54 has realistically 10 to 15 years and increasingly less room for aggressive recovery because retirement income strategies generally require a more conservative posture as the timeline shortens. I want to get specific because these 4 patterns show up in this decade with a consistency that's honestly a little startling once you start looking for them. The first is what I'd call the catch-up panic. Somewhere in the 50s, a lot of people run an honest calculation for the first time and don't love what they see, a retirement number that feels smaller than it should, given how many years of working life have already passed. This triggers a very specific reaction, a sudden shift toward aggressive, higher-risk investment strategies, specifically because the math of steady, moderate growth suddenly feels too slow to close the gap. The problem is that this is precisely the decade with the least room to absorb a significant downturn, which means the catch-up panic often increases risk exposure at exactly the moment risk tolerance should genuinely be decreasing, not increasing. There's a specific irony worth naming here. The instinct behind the catch-up panic is entirely reasonable. Noticing a gap and wanting to close it is a healthy response. What goes wrong is the specific method chosen. A 10 or 15-year timeline is actually still meaningful for moderate, consistent growth to make a real difference, particularly when combined with an increased savings rate. The catch-up panic tends to skip past that calmer, more reliable path in favor of something that feels faster, precisely because the emotional urgency of the gap makes the slower, steadier approach feel inadequate, even when the math says otherwise. The second is the empty nest lifestyle expansion. As children become financially independent, a meaningful amount of monthly cash flow often becomes available for the first time in 20 years. A lot of people, quite reasonably, feel they've earned the right to enjoy some of that newfound flexibility. The trap isn't the enjoyment itself. It's failing to redirect a meaningful portion of that freed up cash flow toward the accelerated retirement savings this decade specifically requires before the new, more expensive lifestyle becomes the new, normal baseline that's hard to walk back from. The third is the parent support blind spot. A significant number of people in their 50s find themselves providing meaningful financial support to aging parents, sometimes planned, often not. This support is frequently generous, well-intentioned, and completely understandable, but it's also financially often invisible in the household budget until it's already substantial because it tends to grow gradually rather than arriving as one clear decision. Households in this position frequently don't realize how much this support is costing their own retirement trajectory until years have passed. And the fourth, probably the least discussed, is healthcare cost underestimation. Most people in their 50s significantly underestimate what healthcare will actually cost in retirement, partly because current employer coverage masks the real cost, and partly because it's simply uncomfortable to calculate. This isn't a minor miscalculation. For many households, healthcare ends up being one of the largest expenses of the retirement years, and underestimating it during the 50s, when there's still time to plan around it, tends to create serious financial strain a decade or more later, when there's much less time to adjust. Here's something worth naming directly. Your 50s get far less specific financial guidance than your 20s, 30s, or even your 60s. Financial content aimed at younger people focuses heavily on getting started, building habits, understanding compound interest, avoiding early mistakes. Financial content aimed at people at or past retirement age focuses on withdrawal strategies, required distributions, and managing an already built nest egg. The 50s sit in an awkward middle ground that most financial content simply skips past, treating it as an extension of the 40s rather than the genuinely distinct decade it actually is. This gap matters because the 50s require a specific kind of financial thinking that's different from both the accumulation-focused advice given to younger people and the distribution-focused advice given to retirees. It's a transition decade, and transition decades are, generally, where the most consequential decisions get made with the least specific guidance available to inform them. There's also a psychological reason this decade gets less attention, one worth being honest about. Talking specifically about the 50s means talking about aging, about mortality in a more concrete way than most content is comfortable engaging with, and about the genuine anxiety of realizing time is finite in a way it didn't feel finite at 30. A lot of financial content avoids this discomfort by staying general, which leaves people in this exact decade with less specific, actionable guidance than almost any other stage of financial life. I think this avoidance does a genuine disservice because the discomfort of naming a limited timeline directly is exactly what tends to produce better decisions, not worse ones. Vague, comfortable advice that avoids the specific reality of this decade tends to leave people making decisions as if they were still in their 30s or 40s with a timeline that no longer accurately reflects where they actually stand. Naming the timeline honestly, uncomfortable as it is precisely what allows for the kind of specific, appropriate planning this decade actually requires. So knowing these four traps exist and knowing this decade gets less specific guidance than it deserves, what actually works? First, run the honest retirement number now, not later, and let it inform strategy rather than panic. Calculate a realistic retirement income target based on actual expected expenses, not a rough guess. If there's a gap, the correct response is a measured increase in savings rate and a careful review of asset allocation, not a dramatic shift toward high-risk investments chasing faster growth. The math of a moderate increase, sustained consistently over 10 to 15 years, is usually more powerful than people expect, without requiring the increased risk that tends to backfire in this specific decade. Running this number tends to do something psychologically useful beyond just producing a figure to plan around. It converts a vague background anxiety into a specific, addressable problem. Vague anxiety tends to produce exactly the kind of reactive, high-risk decisions described earlier. A specific number, even an uncomfortable one, tends to produce a specific plan instead, which is a fundamentally calmer, more sustainable place to make decisions from. Second, treat freed-up cash flow from an empty nest as an opportunity to accelerate, not an opportunity to expand. When a major expense category disappears, before that money establishes a new spending pattern, redirect a substantial portion of it toward retirement savings first. This is genuinely one of the highest leverage moves available in this decade, specifically because it takes money that's already been living without you and points it toward the goal that most needs acceleration right now. Third, have the parent support conversation explicitly with real numbers rather than letting it grow silently. If you're providing financial support to aging parents or expect to, calculate what that actually costs annually and factor it explicitly into retirement planning rather than letting it operate as an invisible, gradually growing expense. This isn't about reducing generosity. It's about making an informed decision rather than an accidental one. Fourth, research actual healthcare costs in retirement now while there's still time to plan around the real number. This single calculation, uncomfortable as it can be to run, tends to be one of the more clarifying exercises available in this decade because it replaces a vague anxiety with a specific, plannable number. And fifth, resist the urge to make any single dramatic financial move in response to catch-up anxiety. If the retirement number feels smaller than hoped, the answer is almost never one big swing. It's a series of smaller, sustained adjustments. Savings rate, spending patterns, working a few additional years if needed, applied consistently over the years remaining in this decade and into the next one. None of these 5 things require dramatic sacrifice or panic. They require treating this specific decade as the distinct financial stage it actually is, rather than an extension of the 40s or a rough draft of retirement planning to be finalized later. Here's what I think matters most about this decade. It's not dangerous because something is going wrong. It's dangerous because it's the last decade where meaningful correction is still relatively comfortable to make. The mistakes covered today don't feel like mistakes while they're happening. They feel like reasonable responses to a season of life with more flexibility and less obligation than the 2 decades before it. The 50s aren't a countdown to something ending. They're the decade where the specific choices made quietly determine what the next several decades actually look like. And that's exactly why they deserve more careful attention than they typically get. If you're in your 50s right now, I want to know, in the comments, tell me, which of these 4 traps feels the most familiar to you, even if you haven't fully acted on it yet? I read every comment, and I think naming which pattern feels closest tends to be genuinely useful, because it's usually the first real step toward addressing it deliberately. If this series has helped you see your own financial picture more clearly, subscribe if you want to keep building this understanding with me, one honest, quiet video at a time. Until next time, take care of your money and take care of this particular decade. It's quieter than people expect, and it matters more than most financial advice ever tells you.